I could go back into history as I have read it about the Kenyan people. You have about three main linguistic groups in the Kenyan space. You have the Bantus, the Nilotes, and you have the Kushites. And all these people had very different ways in which they governed themselves. Some had kings. So you had a king who had a council of elders that would help him make decisions. Some of them fairly advanced in the structure that they had adopted. Then you had a council of elders where you had more of a chief who was not a king and was elected or chosen through a process of being identified by his peers, usually people who went through initiation with him. And it was not just him, because we also had quite renowned women leaders also traditionally. Many of them were in the garb of religious leaders and seers or prophets. But I think over time, when our governance systems was disrupted by the colonialists, and Christianity came in as an agency of change, it changed fundamentally the way we organized ourselves. So the space of the agency of the individual citizens was eroded over time. The Africans were not allowed initially to participate in governance. They were just there to provide labor and pay taxes. They were never involved or consulted in any way in the decisions that informed the colonial state. And the colonial state in the Kenyan space is important to understand. It started off as a private company. So you see a bit of that today, that some countries were set up as colonies right from the onset. But the Kenyan experience is that you had the Imperial East African Company that was administering this protectorate, as it was first called, on behalf of the empire. And so in a business, there's really no much space for consultation. So you would see that, the settlers who are now being given the space to come in and exploit the resources here are the ones who are given opportunities to lead. And even them were not elected initially, they would be appointed. And as they grew financial and economic muscles, they became quite influential. Some continued being nominated in positions of decision making, and others were there in their own right because of the influence that they wielded by virtue of the resources they commanded. And then you had the colony, so we were being administered directly by a governor representing the empire. And again, there was not space for us as Africans until the late 40s, which was very tokenistic. But we proceeded that way until we got our independence and had our first elections. And when we had our first elections, we had a fairly progressive constitution. The same template, the Westminster model that was being given to everybody at that point in time. But we proceeded very quickly to mutilate it. From 1963, between 1963 and 1966, we had made so many changes into that constitution to create what we came in Kenya to be known as the imperial presidency, where the president was actually like a replacement of the queen or the king. Was not accountable for anything, was not bound by the law, and as a matter of fact, even couldn't lose an election. So our first president was elected every other elections, and anyone else who came up as an alternative voice was vanquished politically or even physically. So the president passed on in 1978, and then you have our second president who was not desired by the inner circle of the first president, and they did everything to try and prevent him from assuming office. And he did assume office in 1978. And many people would say was a fairly progressive leader until 1982, when there was an attempted coup to overthrow his government. And the reaction was draconian, and he entrenched himself as, again, an imperial president. One party, him leading everything with a group of people. And during that period, there was really no space for people to be heard. Elections were always a sham. The president decided who was going to be elected, and a semblance of an election would be created to give it some measure of legitimacy. Then we had now the change of constitution in 2002 to create multi-party democracy, where for the first time, I think we were the first time in independent Kenya, we were having space to discuss and express ourselves. So you could have different voices in the political space, and I would say even in the social space. That space expanded quite significantly between 2002 until we had a popular constitution that was promulgated in 2010. That constitution is very progressive. It has a lot of provisions that enable the citizens to be at the center of the state enterprise or the governance enterprise. And we had a president coming in 2002 who was quite keen on, one, expanding economic opportunities, but also had surrounded himself with people who had been known for expanding the space for democracy, for citizens to engage. And so by the time we are promulgating the constitution, we have a fairly open society. So Kenya remains a fairly open society, but we've seen clawbacks from around 2013 when a new president came into office who had issues. He was actually indicted at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, before he was elected. And therefore, that informed the kind of president that he became. Quite, intolerant to civil society, actually he blamed his wars on civil society, while in fact there were criminal acts that were committed in the 2007 post-election violence. And to date, nobody has ever been held to account for the more than 1,600 deaths, destruction of property, and all that. And so those in the civil society found themselves on the receiving end. And I think it's only the resilience of many of us that the Kenyan civic space remains quite vibrant, even though I would say it's quite subdued at the moment. In terms of being able to participate in governance processes, the Constitution created a requirement where, anything that was done in the governance space had to have public participation for it to have legitimacy and therefore legality. And the courts started off way back in 2011 by, cementing this approach, saying that, look, if there is no public participation in this, then it's illegal. So they shut down quite a number of processes, which then put a lot of, or rather catapulted public participation to a norm that could not be ignored in our political structure. So that is what where I would say we are. The courts did their part, but the politicians in their usual way would want to find ways in which that is not implemented. So some, as I said, will see it as a good thing, the minority, and then you had many others who would see it as a bother and something only to be avoided as much as possible, and at best, to just do a checking of the box exercise to comply with the law, but not to go to the depth of making sure the voices are heard.